On the eve of my marriage to Felix, his archenemy died in a car accident. It was only then that I discovered Felix's secret and intense love for her. At the crash site, he held her, crying his heart out. To make up for the regrets, he postponed our wedding and took her ashes on a world tour. After finding closure, he returned with a calm heart to prepare for our marriage. It was only then that he realized. The other ignored body at the crash site was mine. Chapter 1. The day I returned from a business trip, I got into a car accident downstairs at Felix's company. The noon sun shone on me, pale and cold. I floated in the middle of the road, staring blankly at Felix, who was kneeling on the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. His reddened eyes held the face of the person in his arms, his expression full of despair and collapse. I lowered my head to look at Felix's handsome side profile, and a dense, subtle pain spread in my heart. The person in his arms wasn't me. It was his archenemy, Anna. They clashed in business, and in life, they sabotaged each other. Whenever Felix mentioned her, he would show disgust. But at this moment, he looked like an abandoned puppy, burying his head in Anna's neck, whimpering out his secret, heartbreaking love. Anna, wake up. Open your eyes and look at me, I won't go against you anymore. Don't scare me, wake up. Bitterness and confusion surged in my heart. I helplessly looked at Anna. Her face was wiped clean by Felix, and she rested peacefully in his arms, as if she were just asleep. Meanwhile, I lay not far away, like a discarded rag doll, utterly disheveled. The hem of my white dress was lifted by the wind, embarrassingly exposed to the crowd. Yet, from start to finish, my fiancé never once noticed me nearby. Even though I was wearing the white dress he gave me, even though the engagement ring on my finger shone glaringly bright. In his eyes, there was no one but Anna. The paramedics looked at me with pity, wrapping me in a white sheet, and hurriedly lifted me onto a stretcher. As they passed by Felix, he suddenly raised his head. I was stunned. Did he finally recognize me? But in the next moment, he scooped up Anna and rushed forward, crashing into my stretcher, kneeling with a thud before the paramedics. Doctor, please, save her. Chapter 2. In the public eye, Felix is seen as cold and aloof, rarely showing his emotions. Even in front of me, he always maintained a composed demeanor. Even at the height of passion, he would only praise me in a hoarse whisper, breathing heavily in my ear, calling me obedient. But now, for Anna, the one who had stolen countless clients from him, he knelt before everyone without dignity, crying his heart out. I studied Felix's face closely. His features were so finely sculpted, as if carefully carved, but his usual indifferent expression was now completely shattered, tainted with twisted and intense emotions, like a mad dog out of control. Only now do I realize that it wasn't that he couldn't express emotions. It's just that all his hatred, anger, and love were reserved for Anna. The love that once seeped into my bones was stripped away in an instant. I felt a wave of nausea, took a few steps back, unwilling to see his face any longer. Suddenly, a broken phone screen caught my eye. The white phone case, adorned with a bear charm, belonged to Anna. The screen was still on the chat interface with Felix. The last 2 messages were from Felix, "I'm getting married." And Anna's reply, "Wait for me." I suddenly remembered how I died. I hadn't told Felix about my early return from the business trip. As soon as I got off the plane, I rushed straight to his company, eager to surprise him. I remembered how, before I left, he leaned against the doorframe, softly and tenderly saying he would miss me, that we'd get married once I returned. Unconsciously, I quickened my pace. But instead, I ran into Anna downstairs. She was holding her phone, her tone gentle, with a hint of barely perceptible disdain in her eyes. "Did you see clearly, Wendy? As long as I don't agree, your marriage won't happen. He may hate me, but he loves me more. I am the one who is his equal in love." After speaking, she looked me up and down, her lips curling slightly as she said, "I hope you have enough self-awareness to back out. I don't want to have to deal with you." I raised my hand and slapped her. What happened next is blurry, I can only recall a few scattered images. A runaway van, screaming pedestrians, and Felix stumbling toward Anna. Chapter 3. For some reason, my soul couldn't stray far from Felix. I followed him to the hospital, only to be driven away by Anna's family. When he returned, Felix locked himself in his home. He turned off his phone and lay on the sofa, drinking himself into oblivion. He once said that alcohol harms the brain, and even at our engagement party, he didn't touch a drop. But now, he drank day and night, as if trying to drink himself to death to follow Anna. It wasn't until the fourth day that Brady broke in with his assistant, Ruby, and without a word, punched him in the face. "Felix. I know you're hurting, but you must pull yourself together today. Are you not going to her funeral?" Felix turned his head after being hit, his disheveled hair falling over his forehead, making him look utterly exhausted. He let out a faint laugh and spoke softly. "Brady, I regret it. I should have recognized my feelings earlier. When Anna was alive, I kept going against her. She didn't even know I loved her." Brady was stunned. "Anna? Not Wendy?" Hearing my name, Felix was momentarily dazed. He closed his eyes, pressed his fingers against his brows in frustration, and hoarsely murmured. "Did she send you? Anna is dead. Why is she competing with a dead person? It's not like I won't marry her, the wedding is just postponed, tell her to stop making a fuss." I propped my chin, staring at Felix. There wasn't a trace of guilt in his dark, inky eyes. "Oh, right, he still doesn't know I'm dead too." The assistant opened his mouth to say something, but Brady raised his hand to stop him. Brady looked down at Felix, then after a moment, let out a cold laugh. "Fine, since you've decided, then. When she comes back from her trip, I'll talk to her. I hope you won't regret it." After speaking, he turned and left with the assistant, who seemed hesitant to speak. I followed them to the stairwell, hearing the assistant cautiously ask, "Shouldn't we tell President Felix about Wendy?" Brady paused, his voice hoarse and weary. "I'll handle her matter, don't tell Felix yet, he can't handle it. The most important thing is, I doubt Wendy would want to see him either." Leaning against the door frame, I watched Brady's red-rimmed eyes and let out a bitter smile. The three of us grew up together in an orphanage and later attended the same university. After graduation, we co-founded our current company. Back then, Felix and I lived in a shabby basement. When he returned from socializing and saw me eating instant noodles, he lovingly held me in his arms and swore he'd never let me down, promising to give me a happy home. At that time, his greatest wish was to marry me grandly. But now, living in a city center apartment, his biggest headache is how to get rid of me. Chapter 4. 3 days later, I still hadn't figured out how to leave Felix. But Felix, on the other hand, had oddly cleaned himself up. Puzzled, I followed him until he knelt in front of Anna's family's villa, and only then did I realize his intention. He wanted Anna's ashes. Even though I had mentally prepared, my heart reflexively ached. A week had passed, and he didn't care that I hadn't returned, or if I was in danger. Yet here he was, kneeling at the door of his enemy, begging for her ashes. Anna's family was a profit-driven one. They didn't care about the loss of an insignificant daughter, they just wanted to squeeze every last bit of value out of her. They wanted to trade Anna's ashes for the most important project in my hands. It was a project I had worked overtime for months to secure, drinking with clients until I almost vomited blood, and finally ending up on an IV drip in the hospital for 3 days. At that time, Felix had even uncharacteristically scolded me for not taking care of my health. But now, he agreed without hesitation. Amidst the heartache, I felt a bit of regret. The efforts I made for our future had ultimately become stepping stones for his pursuit of Anna. Anna's half-brother brought out the urn. Felix carefully received it. The surrounding lights flickered as he lowered his gaze, his raven-black lashes casting faint shadows on his pale face. A tear slipped from the corner of his reddened eye. "Thank you." His hoarse voice was carried away by the wind. The last bit of love I had in my heart also shattered. Chapter 5. After leaving Anna's house, Felix rushed straight to the airport. On the way, he received a call from Brady. The voice on the other end was anxious and somewhat distorted. "Ruby said you've booked a cruise for a world tour, and you're leaving today. Felix, are you out of your mind?" Felix silently moved the receiver farther away. He clutched the urn tightly, a trace of tenderness rippling through his dark, ink-like eyes. Yes, I'm going with her, he smiled faintly. We've missed out on so many years, I don't want to have any more regrets. I want to love her purely and completely for a year. As for Wendy, the wedding will be postponed. Brady was silent for a long time before he finally couldn't hold back his rage and shouted, How can you still have the nerve to mention Wendy? Wendy is already dead. She died right in front of you. Felix lowered his eyes and sighed softly. Brady, why are you indulging her nonsense too? I haven't left the house these past few days, how could she have died in front of me? Don't make such tasteless jokes anymore. Brady laughed in exasperation. I'm not joking, if you don't believe me. Enough, Brady, no matter what you say, I'm not coming back. Felix interrupted him sternly. With you and Wendy at the company, I'm at ease. His tone was calm yet firm. People only live once, let me indulge myself this time. After speaking, he hung up the phone, decisively taking out the SIM card and forcefully breaking it with his fingers. I lowered my gaze to the now darkened screen, and Brady's frantic face involuntarily appeared in my mind. Given his stubborn nature, I'm really worried about leaving him to manage the company on his own. In fact, even back in school, he had a terrible temper. In the first monthly exam during our senior year, I ranked first in the grade. The day after the results were released, I arrived at the classroom to find my desk stuffed with trash, and someone had carved the words cheating dog into the surface. Before I could react, Brady, furious, tossed his bag aside and dragged the culprit out of the classroom by the collar. Felix, on the other hand, quietly fetched me a cup of hot water and carefully cleaned up my desk, then went to find the teacher to review the security footage. I didn't have to do anything, I just kept securing first place, again and again. Looking back now, this was our dynamic since childhood. Brady would charge forward, Felix would devise strategies, and I would hold the rear. The three of us were indispensable to each other. And now, Brady has lost both of his companions. I'm really worried about him. Felix, however, didn't share that concern. After getting off the plane, he even had the leisure to choose a new, beautiful urn for Anna. It had colorful carvings and was inlaid with diamonds. Bold and flamboyant, just like Anna. Chapter 6. I recalled the first time I met Anna. It was when the three of us went to a bar to celebrate Brady's birthday. Amidst the noisy and lively dance floor, Anna stood out in a red dress, her features striking and beautiful. She drunkenly stumbled into Felix's arms and looked up to meet his gaze. Maybe it was the atmosphere, but she provocatively glanced at me before turning Felix's head and kissing him. Felix froze, his pupils contracted, and he forcefully pushed her away, taking a few steps back. Where did this crazy woman come from? He frowned at Anna, who had fallen onto the broken glass, and then turned to hold my hand. As he said this, his tone was disgusted, and his expression cold. But I noticed a faint blush creeping up his ears. That night, Anna's hand was cut, leaving a scar. Since then, she always wore gloves to events. Felix probably regrets that. That's why now, he clutches the carving knife, his fingers scarred from the cuts, painstakingly engraving her name onto the urn. Beloved Anna. Just a few words, mixed with blood and tears, filled with belated guilt and love. I stood on the balcony of the cruise suite, feeling the sea breeze. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting shifting shadows on Felix's face. He lowered his eyes, gently wiping the bloodstains off the urn. It reminded me of the day I first arrived at the orphanage, and how he wiped away my tears and snot with his small hands. Then, clumsily comforted me, Wendy, don't be scared. Big Brother will always protect you. Chapter 7. Traveling the world with Felix, apart from the occasional nausea, the experience was actually quite pleasant. I had never visited such beautiful places before. He would meticulously plan our itinerary days in advance, then carry Anna's urn and take serious photos of the scenery along the way, sometimes even explaining the history of the places to her. When curious passers-by asked, he would proudly say, "This is my beloved." And our engagement ring? He casually gave it to a street artist on the first leg of our journey, in exchange for a painting of him and Anna embracing in a bar. The trip went smoothly, except for the occasional moment when Felix would stare off into the distance, lost in thought. In the past, we didn't have the time or money to travel, so we always daydreamed about it, lying in our rented room, fantasizing about where we would go one day. But later, when we had the money, we got busier. He once said that when we got married, we would spend our honeymoon in Iceland, watching the northern lights. And when we grew old, we would settle in a peaceful place to retire. But I never got to marry him, and I never got to grow old. It turns out, nothing lasts forever. At any time, anyone can go their separate ways. Chapter 8. A few months later, Felix passed by a bridal shop. Perhaps the wedding dress in the window caught his eye, and he stopped, almost in a trance. I leaned closer to look. The wedding dress was stunning. The cascading skirt flowed down like a waterfall, resembling a misty galaxy descending to earth, with an ethereal charm. It looked just like the one I tried on with Felix back then. Felix quietly stood in front of the window, his pupils shimmering with tiny specks of light, full of longing and nostalgia. That night, he clutched his phone, sitting by the hotel window, scrolling through our old photos all night. From high school, to university, to now. In almost every photo, I'm looking straight at the camera. And he's looking straight at me. As the old photos scrolled across the screen, Felix's finger finally paused on my high school graduation photo. His gaze seemed to cross time, locking with my 18-year-old self. In the next moment, as if burned, he quickly put down the phone and uneasily rubbed his ring finger. But it was empty. The engagement ring had long been traded for a painting. I stood next to Felix, coldly watching him. What is he afraid of? Is he afraid of facing the 18-year-old me, who had eyes only for him? Or is he remembering how much he once loved me and now fears he made the wrong decision? But it doesn't matter anymore. After all, I didn't do anything wrong. What I need to reflect on is my judgment and choices, not my sincerity and love. The next morning, Felix left the house for the first time without taking Anna's ashes. He went to a store and ordered a new pair of diamond rings. The rings were named New Life. The salesperson smiled and asked, "Is it for your wedding?" Felix's lips curved slightly, his eyes full of relief and anticipation. "No, it's for a new beginning." Chapter 9. That night, he buried Anna's ashes on a quiet island, talking to her non-stop throughout the night. "I'm leaving. Wendy is still waiting for me. I let her down once, I can't make the same mistake again. But I don't regret loving you. In this life, we were meant to be apart. In the next life, let's be together properly." After burying Anna, Felix hurriedly booked a ticket to return home. After getting off the plane, he headed straight for the company. Along the way, he remained relatively calm, but his brows revealed an uncontrollable tension and anticipation. However, that anticipation vanished the moment he searched the entire company and couldn't find me. Irritated, he pushed open Brady's office door. I peeked at Brady. It had been a year since I last saw him. He was thinner, but his demeanor had become much steadier. When Felix barged in like this, Brady merely glanced at him indifferently. "Where's Wendy? Is she avoiding me?" Felix's voice was soft, tinged with fatigue. Brady stared at him for a long time. Then, with a cold laugh, he replied, "Didn't I already tell you? She died. She died in the same car accident that killed Anna." Chapter 10. Felix froze. With a bang, the ring box slipped from his hand. The afternoon sun shone brightly, reflecting off the rolling diamond, making people's eyes sting. As if suddenly realizing something, Felix jerked his head up, his face turning as pale as paper. "What did you say?" He gritted his teeth, his voice hoarse as if forced out from his throat. Brady, losing patience, bent down, took some papers from the safe, and harshly threw them at Felix's face. "She died alongside Anna, right in front of you. Before she died, she was still struggling to crawl towards you, hoping you would save her. Didn't you see?" The sharp edges of the papers cut Felix's skin, causing him to turn his head as blood slowly seeped from his fair complexion. His tall figure trembled for a moment, staring blankly at the slowly falling papers. They were my death certificate. "No, impossible, this can't be her." He collapsed to the ground, clutching his chest, gasping for breath. I bent down to take a look. Seeing your own death certificate with your own eyes is quite a strange experience. Just a few lines of text encapsulated my entire 27 years of life. Brady's eyes were cold, his voice thick with suppressed anger. The day she returned from her business trip, she went to the company to find you and happened to run into Anna downstairs. A car lost control and hit both of them. Our sister, who had been with us for 20 years, died right in front of you. And what were you doing at that moment? You were hugging your enemy, crying and begging the doctor to save her. I handled her funeral all by myself and didn't even dare tell you, fearing you couldn't handle it. During those days, I couldn't eat or sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see Wendy crying out in pain to me. But what did you do? You took your enemy's ashes and disappeared on me. Felix, why weren't you the one who died back then? I watched Brady, whose eyes were red with tears, and my heart ached. After all this time, he's the one I can't let go of. Abandoned by his parents as a child, he finally found a family to rely on. But now, he's left all alone again. Felix's dark pupils trembled slightly. The next second, he began to cough violently, a stream of blood gushing from the corner of his mouth, staining his white shirt. In a daze, he reached out, gently touching the blood-stained death certificate. Deceased name, Wendy. Gender, female. For 20 years, he had written my name countless times. But now, he looked at those few characters as if he didn't recognize them, stubbornly and incredulously tracing them over and over. The blood spread out, blooming like a bright red rose on the paper. I looked at Felix clutching the death report, my heart filled with bitterness and sorrow. I'm not feeling sorry for him. I just pity the me who once tried so hard to live. Chapter 11. A wind squeezed through the narrow window gap, making a hoarse and muffled wailing sound. Brady lost his patience and grabbed Felix by the collar, gritting his teeth as he stared at him. What are you trying to disgust me with this pathetic display? Stop degrading yourself here. Felix gently brushed off his hand, raised his sleeve, and wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth haphazardly, calmly looking at Brady. Where are Wendy's ashes? His voice was hoarse, and his dark eyes were filled with a sickly madness. She's still waiting for me to marry her. I still owe her a wedding. Let me see her. Hey! Brady took 2 steps back. Stop dreaming. Felix closed his eyes in despair. After a long pause, he finally choked out. Brady, I'm her family too. Please, let me see her one last time. Brady sneered. Do you think you're worthy? The last thing Wendy saw was you holding another woman, crying your heart out. She didn't even have time to hate you. How could she possibly want to see you? Felix's face turned pale as a sheet. I really don't want to see him. But I don't hate him that much either. After all these years of relying on each other, even if there was no love, there was still familial affection. I just regret it. I regret those days when I was so full of joy, wanting to be with him. Chapter 12. Brady turned and opened the door, calling for his assistant. Ruby, see him out. And don't let him in again. Ruby hesitated for a moment but eventually stepped forward to try and help Felix up. But Felix, like a dead man, refused to move an inch. Ruby sighed. She stood up helplessly and spoke softly, his tone as respectful as ever, but his words were blunt. President Felix, there's something you should know. When Wendy went on her last business trip, she was supposed to be gone for half a month. But she worked overtime, compressing the schedule into just 1 week, just so she could come back early to surprise you for your birthday. But then this happened. She didn't have to die. Felix's head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes fixating on Ruby. What did you say? Ruby ignored him and continued speaking to himself. Oh, and she left a letter with me every time she went on a trip, instructing me to give it to you if anything happened to her. With that, he ran to his desk and returned with a thick stack of envelopes. I remembered now. Every time I went on a long trip, I would leave him a letter. But it wasn't really a will. It was more of a comfort. Because Felix's parents died in an accident when he was 4, without leaving a single word behind. This left him with a severe psychological trauma. When we were in the orphanage, he was always afraid that the people around him would suddenly disappear. Once, I went on a trip with the director, and when I returned, he clung to me and cried all night, afraid I'd leave and never come back, afraid I didn't want him anymore. He kept me up all night, so I imitated how my grandma used to comfort me, cradling his head in my arms and softly whispering in his ear, "Don't cry, I won't leave you." Eventually, it became a habit. For the next 20 years, every time he woke up from a nightmare, I would hold him, gently rub his head, and tell him I was still there. Felix's hands trembled as he urgently tore open an envelope. I leaned over to look. Honestly, I forgot what I wrote in them. I only remembered that every letter began with the same sentence, "I haven't left you." Hot tears dripped down, blurring the words on the paper. Felix lowered his eyes, carefully reading each word. The later letters were more like everyday notes. Sometimes, it was a reminder to take his medicine on time, sometimes a note not to forget to throw out the food in the fridge, sometimes a whimsical request to have a centaur at my funeral. The last letter was written before my last business trip. We had just decided that we'd get married when I returned. I never thought anything would happen to me. So, I didn't leave a will. I left my hopes for our wedding. I wanted Brady to wear a wedding dress and scare Felix when he turned around. I wanted to replace the bouquet with a cat toy, and whoever caught it could adopt an orange tabby after the wedding. I wanted to force Felix to wear a frog costume and dance with me. I wanted a lot of things. But none of it can come true now. Everything went smoothly on the trip, but who would have thought that something would happen right at the entrance of the company? Felix clutched the letter tightly to his chest, crying out in anguish, like a wounded beast on the brink of death. "Wendy! Wendy!" His whole body trembled, his cries nearly silencing his voice. "Wendy, come back. I was wrong. I was really wrong." It seems that only now does he truly realize what he has lost. I squat in front of him, seriously admiring his face filled with unbearable pain, just like before, gently patting his head. My hand passes through his hair, leaving no trace. I regretfully retract my hand. Even though he can't hear me, I still want to say it. "Felix, this time, I'm not staying with you." Chapter 13. Felix cried until he passed out and was sent to the hospital by Brady. After waking up, he was much calmer. He quietly stared at the ceiling, lost in thought. After a long while, he glanced at Brady, who was standing nearby, and got out of bed. Brady didn't move, just watched him coldly. It wasn't until he saw Felix climbing onto the windowsill that he hurriedly stopped him. "What are you doing?" He grabbed Felix's arm and violently threw him to the ground. Felix struggled to get up, silently attempting to climb the windowsill again. Brady, unable to bear it anymore, punched him. "What the hell are you doing?" Felix wiped the blood from his nose, speaking as if it were the most natural thing. "I'm going to accompany Wendy. She's timid, she'd be so scared all by herself. You have the company to manage, it's inconvenient for you to be with her, but I can go." I stepped back a few steps in shock. "Please don't come to be with me, you're such a nuisance." Brady sneered, his tone icy. "Accompany her? Do you think you're worthy? You should live well and spend the rest of your life in pain and despair, redeeming yourself." "I don't think so. A fickle person like him, how could he possibly sincerely repent for me for the rest of his life?" Even Anna, whom he loved so passionately, was casually buried by him. Brady waved towards the door, calling in a few burly nurses. "Keep an eye on him, don't let him die." With that, he turned to leave. Before leaving, he looked at Felix and viciously threatened, "If you die, I'll throw your ashes into the sewer, so you'll never see Wendy." Felix didn't react much. I panicked a little. If he's trapped here, won't I be trapped here too? "Brady, why are you sabotaging your teammate?" Chapter 14. No nurse can stop someone determined to die. Felix secretly hoarded sleeping pills for half a month. Then one evening, he swallowed them all at once behind the nurses' backs. I didn't really care whether he lived or died. Because in all this time, I've never seen any other souls. After his death, I most likely won't see him either. But as Felix gradually fell asleep, I began to feel disoriented. Time raced by like a runaway horse beside my ears. The sunset slowly climbed over the desk piled with papers and books. I stared at the chalk-dusted podium, while the noisy chatter of classmates filled my ears. Wendy. The clear voice of a young man stood out amidst the piercing noise. I turned my head to look. 18-year-old Felix had slightly curly hair, swaying gently with his breath and the breeze, coated in a golden glow. Wendy, it really is you. His eyes reddened, and he cautiously grasped my hand, pressing it against his cheek, gently rubbing it. Have you come to take me with you? I heard that after death, the person you love most will come to take you away. So it's true. Suddenly, everything around us went silent. Time seemed to freeze at this moment, leaving only his rapid breathing and the beeping of some unknown machine. I coldly tried to pull my hand back, but he only held on tighter. No. Felix was stunned. Why? I chuckled and repeated, why? Has my unconditional love made you forget to look in the mirror? What makes you think that after your death, I'd overlook everything and come to take you? Felix panicked. No, Wendy, I didn't know that was you. His tears fell on my hand, and he cried like a drenched puppy. I disdainfully wiped them dry with my uniform. Does it matter whether you knew or not? Weren't you the one holding her and crying? Felix clutched my hand, his thick black eyelashes trembling slightly. Wendy, I'm sorry, it's my fault, I love you, I just want to be with you, He trailed off. What do you mean, just? I tilted my head and quietly watched him. You just got bored with me, you just found this life too dull, and wanted some new excitement. You just thought that I, as not only your lover but also your family, would always tolerate you, always wait for you. I sighed, prying his fingers off one by one. Felix, you're inherently selfish and self-centered. I shouldn't have had any hopes for you. Felix closed his eyes, not daring to look at me. Wendy, I'm sorry. He probably doesn't remember that he was the one who confessed first. He said he would never leave me, no matter what. The one who once said he'd love me forever, in the end, still said, I'm sorry. Wendy, hit me, curse me, hate me if you must, but you can't leave me. I looked at his guilty and despairing expression and chuckled lightly. Felix, do you know? Actually, after I died, my soul has always been by your side. He suddenly looked up, as if realizing something, and his face instantly turned pale. I watched you cry your heart out for Anna, watched you give away my project, watched you take her on a trip around the world. I watched you take her to places I always wanted to go. It's disgusting. During that time, all I ever wanted was to leave you. He tried to hold on to me. Wendy. I impatiently shook off his hand. Enough, let's end it here. Felix, we were never meant to be. Let me go. I stood up and walked toward the light. This time, Felix didn't follow. Unresolved matters will eventually reconcile, and everything will fall into place. Chapter 15. Just now, I finally figured out why I was trapped by Felix's side. It was because of our marriage vows. I rubbed the scorching, constricting wedding ring on my finger. Why? He had thrown away his ring, yet I was the one trapped. The diamond on my finger sparkled faintly. Felix's youthful, excited face from when he proposed appeared before my eyes, and his vows echoed in my ears, as if it were just yesterday. I lowered my gaze and, without hesitation, took off the ring. The ring disintegrated into silver light, slowly fading away. I felt a long-lost sense of relief. My body felt light, as if I could float away at any moment. At the end of the light, I saw Anna. She leaned against the wall, looking at me with a complicated expression. Why did he choose you in the end? I glanced at her and politely replied, none of your business. Then I continued to walk forward. Behind me, her resentful question echoed, aren't you going to regret leaving him like this? I didn't answer her. Regret? I was brave and sincere, dared to love and hate. I did nothing wrong. The one who should regret, isn't me.
Brady's side story. Chapter 1. I can't quite remember which Friday night it was. I had dinner with Wendy and Felix, as usual, and then left. Years later, when I think back on it, that ordinary goodbye turned out to be the last time I'd ever see them. Chapter 2. Felix didn't make it. He took too many sleeping pills and had no desire to live. Now all of my family is gone. In the end, I couldn't bring myself to scatter his ashes in the sewer. After all, we grew up together as brothers. So, I found where he buried Anna. I buried them together. I'm such a genius. Chapter 3. Wendy's epitaph was engraved according to what she once mentioned. Broken Earth, half a star, 1-star review. Every few weeks, I visit her. I tidy her grave and pour her some tea. Sometimes, when the company is too busy and I'm in a hurry, I don't have time to brew tea. So, I just pour some oriental tea leaves as a gesture. She wouldn't be able to taste the difference anyway. Chapter 4. Recently, 4-leaf clovers have been growing in the cracks at the base of her tombstone. When I walk over, they sway and wave at me. Just like when Wendy sat on the swing at the orphanage, waving at me from afar, calling me brother. Chapter 5. 5 years after getting married, my daughter was born. She's so tiny, even smaller than Wendy was when she first came to the orphanage. When I took her from the nurse's arms, I suddenly froze. Tears uncontrollably welled up in my eyes. On her shoulder, a 4-leaf clover-shaped birthmark gently waved at me with her breath.
Anna's side story. Chapter 1. Actually, the first time I met Felix wasn't at the bar. It was at a presentation by Anna's family. The three of them sat together like an inseparable trio. Felix gazed tenderly and attentively at Wendy by his side, not sparing even a single glance for anyone else. When she raised her hand, he handed her water. When she shivered, he offered his jacket. I was envious. At that moment, my good-for-nothing half-brother approached me with a disgusting smirk. Getting into the company doesn't mean anything. Dad will never entrust an important project to a girl. The family fortune is mine, don't even dream about it. I envied Wendy even more. What does it feel like to be favored by someone so thoughtful and considerate? So that day at the bar, I boldly made my move. Though he pushed me away, we both knew he had taken the bait. Wendy's heartbroken expression was truly beautiful. Chapter 2. After that, every time he saw me, he would give me a fierce glare. Seeing that usually calm and composed face display such a range of emotions because of me gave me a sense of accomplishment. In the business world, we ruthlessly clashed. In life, we insulted each other whenever we met. When the insults got too harsh, I would pull his hair and bite his lips. He never backed down either. I thought I was the most special person in his heart. It wasn't until later that I realized how wrong I was. Chapter 3. That dog Brady buried Felix next to me. According to the old ghost, only souls without lingering attachments can reincarnate. In extremely rare cases, souls without attachments may remain in the human world due to certain bonds. During that time, neither humans nor souls can see her. Wendy must be in that situation. I can't reincarnate. I have lingering attachments. My family doesn't love me, they use me as a resource to trade for projects. The person I love doesn't love me, he treated me as a toy for his thrill-seeking. I want someone to love me, but that's impossible. Felix can't reincarnate either. He's even more pathetic. He hopes Wendy will forgive him. That's even more impossible. So here we are, despising each other, never to be reborn.